Hi friends, welcome to this latest episode of the Nationalist View, and we have with us a very special guest, Professor Dr. Sriparna Pathak ji. Dr. Pathak, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thank you, Arunji. Always a pleasure speaking with you and being on your show.
Thank you, Dr. Pathak, for taking time out from your busy schedule. And Dr. Pathak is a professor of China Studies and the founding director of the Center for Northeast Asian Studies at OP Jindal Global University. And we'll be giving a detailed bio of Dr. Pathak in the description also. We'll also be sharing links of some of the works which Dr. Pathak has got published, and you can go through them, and that too will also be in the description. Today we are going to talk about China, and the conversation will have broadly two segments. One, we are going to talk about specifically in Indian context, and second, we are going to talk about in the West Asian crisis context. So, on April 10th, 2026, Ministry of Civil Affairs of China announced uh, new names for 23 places which are actually in India, which are part of the Indian territory. And but China has renamed them, and this is not the first time they have done it. So it has become more frequent, especially after 2017, it appears. So, Dr. Pathak, is China's renaming of places in Arunachal Pradesh, is it a form of cartographic warfare? And what strategic message is it sending? And can these symbolic moves translate into real territorial leverage over time?
Thank you so much, Arunji. China's repeated renaming of places in Arunachal Pradesh, it is cartographic aggression or cartographic warfare because it's simply not just bureaucratic housekeeping. Since 2017, China's Ministry of Civil Affairs has issued 6 batches of so-called standardized geographical names for locations inside of India in India's territorial sovereignty. It calls it Zangnan. And the latest list, which was released in April, has added 23 names for features like mountain passes, peaks, rivers, settlements, and that brings the cumulative total to well over 100. Previous batches included 11 names in 2023, about 30 in 2024, and 27 in May last year. Now, China calls this as routine standardization in what it says is its sovereign territory. Of course, India has rejected them as preposterous, vain, mischievous, and legally void. And that's just simply because Arunachal Pradesh was, is, and always will remain an integral and inalienable part of India. What message is China sending here? See, these moves of renaming are deliberate, they are timed, and they are multi layered signals within Beijing's broader three warfares doctrine: psychological, media, and legal warfare. And what they try to do is to assert their so called cultural sovereignty by using Tibetan derived names and linking to the region of this so called Zangnan. It tries to reinforce its narrative that Arunachal is an extension of historic Tibet, which unfortunately now is under full Chinese control. And they reject the McMahon Line, which is the de facto border since the 1914 Shimla Convention. They also do domestic narrative building and psychological preparation. Repeated official statements, maps, and lists create these so called facts on paper for Chinese citizens. What they do is trying to cultivate domestic legitimacy. If tensions escalate, the public already views the area as inherently Chinese, and this renaming is just low cost psy-ops or psy-warfare, which normalizes the claim internally. They also try to diplomatically pressure, and whenever there are visits by Dalai Lama, for example, PM Modi inaugurating infrastructure like the Sela Tunnel or border development, that is exactly around the timing when these lists or these names will come cropping up. It's a very calibrated response which signals displeasure while avoiding direct military confrontation. They want leverage in future negotiations. They have long proposed so called territorial swaps, like keeping Aksai Chin while conceding Arunachal and so on. But the fact is that both are India's sovereign territory. So why should India even get into these sort of theatrics with China? The renaming creates an administrative paper trail which can be invoked in talks, in maps, or even international arbitration to bolster this legal moral case. So while it seems, just as a simple layer, there are multiple levels to it. So that's what China is doing, and it's very much cartographic warfare.
So now I also wanted to talk a little bit about, you said, the three front war. So what exactly is this three front war?
So, three front war or psychological or legal and media warfare is a very important facet of China's strategies, China's military warfare. And they understand that territory cannot be gained just by outright military prowess. One cannot forget here that the last full scale war which China had was with Vietnam in 1979, in which also they got a very bloody nose. So, to what extent are they fully military prepared is a big question mark. Over and above that, as we saw during Galwan and so on, well, PLA officers don't really fare well. And there are a lot of awesome reports on how they face depression. They cannot really adjust and adapt to those extremely cold and depressing and high altitude mountain terrains, which the Indian Army thankfully can, given that we've had our share of trysts and experiences of giving bloody noses to the Pakistanis. So, given that China has this peculiar situation with the Indian Army, what they also are doing is that psychologically prepare the grounds so that the narrative which is formed in the minds of civilians from democracies over the years is that Arunachal was never really there, and it was always southern Tibet. How do you really do that? Does China have historical documents? Because if it did, it would have showcased it by now. But it has not been able to, which is why it wants to create this narrative, wants to create a history. 10 years from now, using, say, Deep Seek, using journalists from democracies, including India, constantly calling it Zangnan, a narrative is formed. And say, for example, let's take a child who was, say, born 5 years ago, let's say he or she is born in 2021, in 10 years, if this constant narrative peddling is given that this is southern Tibet, he or she starts assuming it is southern Tibet. So that's an attempt to use psychology, create a historic narrative to leverage India's media and other sorts of media from democracies and to prepare the grounds so that this can be used in some sort of a legal format in any future negotiation or discussion. So that's what the whole thing is all about.
So, now let's come to the other segment, the West Asia crisis, the Iran war, which is happening. So, there has been a lot of conversation about China playing a role of mediator behind the scenes and the Islamabad talks, which happened. So, actually, it was at the behest of basically China, and China is playing a crucial role. So, what role is China playing in the Iran conflict? Is it acting as a genuine mediator or primarily safeguarding its own strategic and economic interests? And does it actually have a skin in the game?
Right. So see, what China is currently trying to do in this Gulf crisis or the Iran US crisis is that it's trying to position itself as a diplomatic mediator and advocate for de escalation, while its actions primarily serve its own strategic and economic interests. It's not acting as a fully neutral or genuine mediator in the sense of an impartial broker willing to pressure its partners aggressively or risk any sort of major cost. Beijing's approach reflects classic great power pragmatism, rhetorical support for Iran, paired with limited material aid, avoidance of direct military entanglement, a very heavy emphasis on protecting its own energy flows, trade routes, and its broader West Asian influence. What China has done is that it has strongly condemned US and Israeli actions as illegal, aggression, violations of sovereignty, and so on. It's also dispatched Special Envoy Chai Chun for shuttle diplomacy across Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and others, urging ceasefires. It's been urging ceasefires. It's been urging dialogue. It's been urging respect for territorial integrity. It's joined and supported initiatives like a Pakistani led 5 point plan for ceasefire and reopening of the Straits of Hormuz. Um, what they're doing is that they're building on China's earlier success in the 2023 Iran Saudi confrontation, and it enhanced its reputation back then as a regional diplomat. Currently, what it's doing is that it's just building or trying to build on that, conducting numerous high level calls, emphasizing all these rhetorical fair stances, and so on. China has largely stayed on the sidelines, actually. It's offered minimal concrete support to Tehran. It's revealed constraints it has on its own influence as a partner. It has avoided deep entanglement. It's tried to focus instead on evacuating its citizens, monitoring risks to Gulf stability, and so on. Xi Jinping is trying to project global responsibility without the burdens of enforcement or security guarantees which the US or other actors have historically provided. In simple words, it's just safeguarding its own strategic and energy interests because Iran supplies a significant portion of China's discounted oil. Um, the broader Gulf region accounts for half of China's oil imports. Disruptions like these actually spike global prices. They threaten Beijing's economy, which is already in the doldrums. So it's trying its level best to showcase itself as this very unbiased, neutral, um, you know, uh, neutral actor which wants peace, but what it actually wants is just its own selfish interests. So, which is what it is. Are there limits to this? See, the Chinese or the PRC, they lack the leverage or willingness to force major concessions from Iran or from US or from Israel. Its partnership with Tehran is just transactional, it's asymmetric, economically vital for Iran, but secondary for China, which is cultivating ties across the region. Beijing, historically, if you see the pattern, Beijing prioritizes stability over solidarity, which is why it uses balanced language, protecting Iran and other regional countries. Other regional countries are getting attacked by Iran, you know. So it's just mirroring the approach where it has taken elsewhere. Rhetorical alignment with partners like Iran or Russia, while hedging for economic continuity. So it's just instrumental. It's not really genuine.
So, no, if there is a kind of if you can elaborate a little bit more in terms of the impact of the West Asian crisis on Chinese economy, because as we know that there is censorship in China, so the numbers and the real impact doesn't seem to be coming out. But while the rest of the democracies, so there is openness, there is transparency. So whatever impact the West Asian crisis is having on their economies, so that's kind of out there in the open. So how do you see the impact of, as you rightly mentioned, that especially on their energy and trade flows? So what is largely the impact on the Chinese economy, which is, as you rightly mentioned, it which is already in doldrums.
Hmm, hmm. So, I think a couple of days ago, the Iranian embassy in Mumbai had itself tweeted as to how, Chinese ships are also under the scan and are not being allowed to pass and so on. Coming to this blockade, Iranian blockade, US naval blockade, it raises freight, it raises insurance costs. But the fact also is that China has some strategic reserves. It has done pre war stockpiling and it has tried to diversify and just tackle energy shortfalls. So there are longer term risks though, and they center on global demand, slowdowns hitting exports, and so on. And there, energy prices have also increased within China. See, one thing is that while they have buffers, the costs are still rising. China is the world's largest crude importer, about 12 million barrels per day in 2025, and roughly 50% of seaborne oil and 30% of liquefied natural gas transits from the Strait of Hormuz for China. Iran alone supplied about 13% of China's crude in 2025, often at steep discounts and via shadow fleets from China, RMB settlements, and so on. Now, Hormuz traffic dropped sharply with Iranian strikes, with US strikes, and so on. So Iranian production or exports to China fell initially. Um, China has been trying to ensure that its ships continue moving through. Gulf suppliers like Saudi or UAE cut output or face rerouting limits because, well, they are getting affected by Iranian blows and Iranian strikes. China entered the crisis with record stockpiles, about say 1.4 billion barrels, which can cover 120 days of net imports. Plus, they had some floating Iranian oil in Asian storage and so on. Um, Pre-war, their buying had surged by 16% in say January to February 2026. They're also reaching out to Russia. But the thing here is that if, say, there's a sustained 25% oil price rise, then 0.5% of its GDP will get trimmed. It's already somewhere around 4%. It is having massive youth unemployment, massive different sort of crisis in the Chinese economy, and so on. So, what is going to happen is that the conflict hits China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative corridors, which are centered on Iran, say $100 billion plus in energy infrastructure commitments. Um, Projects face suspension, projects face delays or damage. Overland and sea routes are riskier. They force a shift towards risk management over expansion. Gulf instability raises shipping costs, raises insurance, complicating manufactured goods exports and petroleum imports for China. So China's export-led growth stands exposed over here. Higher global energy prices risk a slowdown or recession in key markets, which will lead to lesser demand for Chinese goods. So it is severely affected, which is why you hear these constant shrill cries about de-escalation, China as a responsible mediator, China wanting peace, and so on. Its economy has been affected, which is why it would want the crisis to stop at the earliest.
And what would be the impact on you briefly mentioned, if you can explain it a little bit more, what would be the impact on basically the Belt and Road Initiative, especially if this conflict in West Asia is prolonged?
Right. So this 2026, West Asian crisis, it's actually a stress test for China because it's exposing its vulnerabilities. And China is now actually trying to accelerate shifts towards somewhat a more resilient or mini corridor sort of approaches. Um, Direct hits to BRI in West Asia, one cannot ignore that. Iran was positioned as a pivotal land and maritime hub in the China, Central Asia, West Asia economic corridor. Uh, and projects are disrupted. There's uncertainty. There's raised security premiums, insurance costs, and so on. So, in the Gulf region, if you see between just 2019 to 2024, China invested about 89 billion US dollars. So, it's a huge question mark. The crisis spills over to connected corridors such as the extension of the China-Pakistan economic corridor towards Iran and Afghanistan to overland routes to Europe. It's striking at BRI's core assumption that massive economic connectivity can be insulated from geopolitics and military shocks. Broader regional effects include heightened risks to their shipping. What are they doing right now? Because it's also important to understand that while they have a problem at hand, what exactly are they doing now, and how will that have implications for India and other democratic actors? What they're trying to do is energy diversification, accelerated shifts towards Russia, pipelines at capacity, Central Asia, North Africa, Myanmar. They're doing all of this while stockpiling domestically. They already did this pre-war buying. They already did this pre-war floating of storage. They provided, tried to get some cushions, trying to just safeguard itself. What's going to happen from here on is that there's going to be further evolution of the Belt and Road Initiative, because this initiative has already been reinvented as a more pragmatic tool, selling all sorts of digital Silk Road ideas and green BRI and those sorts of things. There's going to be further evolution, focusing on very selective high-value projects, oil or gas, but also projecting this clean energy elements and so on, so on. What it's going to do from here on is that it'll try to secure more resources. It'll try to secure more markets. It'll try to secure more supply chains and will push for more influence for multipolarity. When it comes to multipolarity, given that we have the BRICS summit in India, it'll try to get India in as well. But unfortunately, our goals do not align on this. Their whole focus is for their own purposes while they keep talking and touting about multipolarity and so on. Prolonged instability highlights this core tension in China's rise, expanding economic interest without corresponding hard power. It's very important that while economic prowess increases, correspondingly hard power also increases. China doesn't put boots on the ground. China doesn't go in for a serious military discourse or talk. Beijing so far has preferred to free ride on US or Japan or India has provided stability in different quarters of the world. They always criticize unilateralism, but they do exactly the same. So um, it's going to be difficult from here on, and not just for China, for its selfish reasons. When it tries to push back or realign or navigate this, it's going to have implications for other actors in Asia in particular.
Yeah. One last question to conclude, though there is no overt or a direct link between China's cartographic offensive and its so-called the conflict diplomacy in the West Asia. But if we try to look at the larger picture, so and bring these two elements together, so what does it reveal about, the long-term global strategy of China?
Hmm. See, these are actually parts of Chinese foreign policy, which is why I'm so glad that you brought both of them together in the format of a question. China's approach to cartographic assertion and conflict diplomacy, they reveal a consistent long-term global strategy. Incremental revisionism through gray zone and hybrid tools, combined with positioning for economic hedging, sweet talking other countries against which it might actually be doing cartographic aggression. Um, its pursuit of multipolar influence is also part of this, uh, avoiding great power confrontation and so on. So it's not just reckless expansionism, but a very calculated, patient strategy rooted in the CCP's emphasis on active defense, three warfares, and self-reliance to achieve their own selfish, narrow goals. Renaming campaigns in Arunachal Pradesh, they're just right now low cost actions below the threshold of armed conflict, which is going to gradually alter perceptions. I hope it doesn't happen, but that's what their hope is. The attempt is to create administrative facts, to normalize claims, and so on. The question is, why does China actually need these excessive territories? Because resources, be it in the form of oil, LNG, gas, and all of those things, they're all of those are resources for different purposes related to industrialization and economic power. China needs resources, so which is why it would want more and more and more territory. It would want to, dig more in whatever territory it wants to really occupy, and it's just going to it's a part of its preparation for longer term conflicts. And unfortunately, conflicts are the norm of this 21st century world order. So even in Myanmar, and there's just a new government which has come in, and well, China does have BRI projects, and there is a question of energy projects there. So it's going to try and hedge. Myanmar is way too close to India, so it's also going to stoke some more unrest in Northeast India using psychological warfare, using free media, using the existence of social media, and so on. What's the purpose? It's tied to energy goals. Um, all of this is part of its gray zone. It uses gray zone warfare against Philippines, Taiwan, different sorts of gray zone warfare for different sorts of countries that it's against. Overall, it just tries to avoid entanglement, but it has very clear cut goals. And these are all parts, different strands of Chinese foreign policy. So, thank you for raising that question.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Pathak, for joining the show, and we hope to host you back soon again. And thank you, viewers, for watching. Thank you, Dr. Pathak.
Thank you so much, Arunji.